Stefan Hoffman had always been a man of routine. Every morning at 5:30, his alarm would sound in the small but well-kept house on the eastern edge of St. Louis. He would rise quietly, careful not to wake his wife, and make his way to the kitchen where he would prepare coffee in the same steel percolator they had received as a wedding gift nearly 30 years ago. By 6:15, he would be out the door, heading to his job as a maintenance supervisor at the downtown convention center, a position he had held with quiet dedication for over 2 decades. His wife, Emma Hoffman, kept a different schedule. She worked evening shifts at the Marriott Grand Hotel, managing banquet services and coordinating events that often ran late into the night. Their schedules rarely aligned, passing each other in the hallway with brief kisses and promises to talk later. But on Sundays, they had an unspoken agreement. Sunday mornings belonged to them. They would sit together at the small kitchen table, sharing breakfast and reading sections of the newspaper aloud to one another, a ritual that had survived job changes, financial struggles, and the gradual emptying of their home as their 2 children grew up and moved away. Stefan was not a man who spoke easily about his feelings. He had grown up in a household where emotion was considered a private matter, something to be managed internally rather than displayed. But those who knew him well understood that his love for Emma was the central fact of his life. He spoke of her constantly at work, sharing small stories about her day, her observations, her plans. His co-workers teased him gently about it, calling him old-fashioned, but there was respect in their humor. In a world where marriages dissolved with alarming frequency, Stefan and Emma represented something steady and enduring. Their son, Marcus Hoffman, had been the light of their lives. Born when Emma was 24 and Stefan was 26, Marcus had been a thoughtful child who grew into a responsible young man. He worked in construction, took pride in his craftsmanship, and had recently become a father himself. Stefan and Emma's grandson, a bright-eyed boy named Jacob, had become the subject of countless photographs that Stefan kept in his wallet and showed to anyone who would look. Marcus lived in East St. Louis, just across the river, in a neighborhood that had seen better days but where he had managed to find affordable housing. Stefan worried about the area. Crime rates had been climbing, and there were stories in the news about shootings and robberies that made him uneasy. But Marcus was careful. He kept to himself, worked hard, and focused on providing for his son. Stefan respected that. He had raised his son to be self-sufficient, and Marcus had taken that lesson to heart. On a Sunday evening in late April, Stefan and Emma sat together in their living room. The television was on, playing the local news at low volume. Emma had just returned from an earlier shift at the hotel, and Stefan had prepared a simple dinner of roasted chicken and vegetables. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from decades of shared meals and mutual understanding. Emma mentioned that she had been contacted by a reporter the week before. There had been a series of robberies in downtown parking garages, and the reporter was doing a story about safety concerns for hotel workers who finished their shifts late at night. Emma had declined to be interviewed. She did not like drawing attention to herself, and she believed the hotel's security measures were adequate. Stefan had agreed with her decision, but made a mental note to check in with her more frequently about her commute. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Stefan noticed that Emma seemed preoccupied. She stood at the bathroom sink, brushing her teeth, staring at her reflection in the mirror with an expression he could not quite read. When he asked if something was wrong, she shook her head and smiled, telling him she was simply tired. He accepted her answer, but later, as he lay in the darkness listening to her breathing beside him, he felt a faint unease that he could not name. 3 days later, Emma Hoffman would be dead, and Stefan's life, built on routine and quiet devotion, would collapse into something he could never have imagined. The phone rang at 11:43 on a Wednesday night. Stefan had been asleep for less than an hour, exhausted from a long day spent overseeing repairs to the convention center's electrical system. The sound cut through the darkness of the bedroom, jarring and insistent. He reached for the device on his nightstand, his mind still foggy with sleep, expecting perhaps a wrong number or a telemarketer who had not checked the time. The voice on the other end was professional, but strained. It belonged to a police officer from the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. The officer asked if he was Stefan Hoffman, husband of Emma Hoffman. Stefan sat up immediately, his heart beginning to pound in his chest. He confirmed his identity, his voice tight with sudden fear. The officer asked if he could come to the downtown area, to the Marriott Grand Hotel. There had been an incident. Emma had been involved. They needed him to come as soon as possible. Stefan asked what kind of incident. The officer hesitated, and in that pause, Stefan felt something inside him begin to break. The officer said only that it was serious, that Emma had been hurt, and that they would explain everything when he arrived. Stefan's hands were shaking as he ended the call. He dressed quickly, pulling on jeans and a sweater without thinking. His movements automatic. He did not call anyone. He did not know what to say. He simply got into his car and drove toward the city, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The drive took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Stefan's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. An accident, a fall, a robbery. He thought about Emma's voice on the phone earlier that evening when she had called to tell him she would be working late. She had sounded normal, maybe a little tired, but nothing that suggested danger. He had told her to be careful, the same thing he always said, and she had laughed gently and promised she would. That laugh now echoed in his mind, and he felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. When he arrived at the hotel, the scene was chaos. Police cars were parked at angles across the street, their lights flashing in silent rhythm. Yellow tape cordoned off the entrance to the parking garage. Officers moved in and out of the building, speaking into radios, taking notes, photographing the area. Stefan approached the perimeter, his legs unsteady beneath him. An officer stopped him, asking his name. When Stefan identified himself, the officer's expression shifted into something that looked like pity. He was escorted inside, past the tape, past the cameras, into a world he had never imagined entering. A detective met him near the entrance to the garage. The man was in his 40s, with graying hair and tired eyes. He introduced himself as Detective Raymond Pierce. He asked Stefan to sit down, gesturing to a bench near the hotel lobby. Stefan refused. He wanted to know what had happened. He wanted to see Emma. The detective placed a hand on his shoulder, firm but not unkind, and told him to sit. Stefan obeyed, his body suddenly heavy. Detective Pierce explained that Emma had been shot. She had been found behind her car on the 5th floor of the parking garage shortly after 7 in the evening. Hotel security had heard gunfire and called the police immediately. By the time officers arrived, Emma was unresponsive. Paramedics had attempted to revive her, but she had been pronounced dead at the scene. Stefan heard the words, but they did not seem real. They were sounds without meaning, descriptions of events that could not possibly involve his wife. He asked how many times she had been shot. The detective hesitated before answering. 3 times. Stefan's vision blurred. He asked if she had suffered. The detective said he did not know, but that it had likely been quick. Stefan did not find comfort in that. He asked if they knew who had done it. The detective said they were investigating. There had been other incidents in the same garage over the past few days. They believed it might be related to a series of robberies targeting people leaving work late at night. Stefan felt something shift inside him, something cold and sharp. He asked if Emma had been robbed. The detective said they were still processing the scene, but her purse had been found near her body, and her personal belongings appeared to be intact. Stefan looked at the detective directly, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. If she had not been robbed, then why had she been shot? The detective had no answer. Stefan was not allowed to see Emma's body. The scene was still being documented, and the medical examiner had not yet arrived. He was told he could identify her later, at the morgue. The word morgue struck him like a physical blow. He sat on the bench, staring at the floor, trying to comprehend that the woman he had eaten breakfast with 3 days ago was now evidence in a homicide investigation. An officer brought him water. Stefan did not drink it. Another officer asked if there was someone they could call, a family member or friend who could be with him. Stefan shook his head. He needed to call his son. He needed to tell Marcus that his mother was dead. But he could not make himself pick up the phone. Not yet. Not while he was still trying to believe it himself. Stefan called Marcus at 2 in the morning. His son answered on the 4th ring, his voice thick with sleep and confusion. Stefan tried to speak, but the words would not come. There was a long silence on the line, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. Marcus asked what was wrong, his tone shifting from drowsy to alert. Stefan forced himself to say it. "Your mother is gone. She was shot tonight. She did not make it." Marcus did not respond immediately. Then came a sound Stefan had not heard since his son was a child, a raw, broken sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep and unreachable. The funeral was held on a Saturday afternoon at a small chapel on the outskirts of St. Louis. Emma had not been a religious woman, but she had attended services there occasionally with a friend, and Stefan thought she would have appreciated the simplicity of the place. The turnout was larger than he had expected. Colleagues from the hotel filled the back rows. Neighbors from their street came to pay respects. Former classmates of Marcus appeared, people Stefan had not seen in years. They approached him with hushed condolences, gripping his hand, offering words that blurred together into a single, meaningless hum. Marcus stood beside him throughout the service, silent and rigid. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. He had cried in the days following Emma's death, but now he seemed to have retreated into himself, becoming distant and unreachable. Stefan wanted to comfort him, to say something that might ease the weight they both carried, but he had no words. Grief had made them both mute. The pastor spoke about Emma's kindness, her dedication to her work, her love for her family. Stefan listened without hearing. He stared at the closed casket at the front of the chapel, unable to reconcile the polished wood with the woman who had laughed at his jokes and scolded him for leaving his shoes in the hallway. Detective Pierce attended the service, standing near the back, his presence a quiet reminder that Emma's death was not simply a tragedy, but a crime still unsolved. After the burial, Stefan returned to the house alone. Marcus had offered to stay with him, but Stefan had insisted he go home to his son. Jakob needed his father, and Stefan needed time to think. The house felt different now, hollow and too quiet. Emma's presence had filled every room, her voice calling from the kitchen, her footsteps on the stairs, her habit of leaving books open on the coffee table. Now there was only silence. 3 days after the funeral, Stefan received a call from Detective Pierce. The detective asked if he could come by the house to discuss the investigation. Stefan agreed, and within an hour, Pierce was sitting in the living room, a notebook open on his lap. He explained that they had made progress. A suspect had been identified through surveillance footage from the hotel and nearby businesses. His name was Deshaun Wilson, a man with an extensive criminal record. He had been arrested 2 days after Emma's death, following an attempted robbery in the same parking garage. Stefan listened carefully. He asked if Wilson had confessed to shooting Emma. Pierce said no. Wilson had denied involvement in her death, though he had admitted to the subsequent robberies. The evidence against him was strong. Video footage placed him in the garage around the time of the shooting. A firearm had been recovered when he was arrested. Ballistics tests were still being conducted, but the district attorney's office was confident they had enough to charge him with first-degree murder. Stefan asked the question that had been gnawing at him since the night Emma died. Why had she been shot if nothing had been taken? Pierce hesitated before answering. He said it was possible that Wilson had attempted to rob her, and she had resisted. Or perhaps he had been startled and fired in panic. Stefan pointed out that Emma's purse had been found near her body, untouched. Her car keys were still in her hand. It did not look like a robbery gone wrong. It looked like an execution. Pierce acknowledged the inconsistency, but said that violent crimes did not always follow logical patterns. People acted irrationally under pressure. Stefan did not argue, but he also did not accept the explanation. Something about the official narrative felt incomplete, as though important pieces were being overlooked or dismissed. That night, Stefan could not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone, scrolling through news articles about Emma's death. Most of them were brief, mentioning her name, her age, and the fact that she had been killed in a downtown parking garage. One article included a statement from the hotel expressing condolences and emphasizing their commitment to guest and employee safety. Another mentioned the arrest of Deshaun Wilson and described him as a repeat offender with a history of violent crime. But none of the articles addressed the question that consumed Stefan. Why Emma? She had worked at that hotel for 20 years. She knew the routines, the security protocols, the safest routes to her car. She was not careless. She was not reckless. So why had she been targeted? Stefan opened his laptop and began searching for more information. He found court records, police reports, news coverage of previous incidents involving Wilson. He read about robberies, assaults, parole violations, but nothing explained why a man who had spent years committing opportunistic crimes would suddenly shoot a woman without stealing anything from her. As dawn broke, Stefan made a decision. He would not wait for the police to give him answers. He would find them himself. Stefan began by visiting the parking garage where Emma had died. He went on a Tuesday morning during business hours, when the structure was busy with hotel guests and conference attendees. Security cameras were mounted at every entrance and exit, their dark lenses tracking movement throughout the building. Stefan walked slowly through each level, searching for the spot where his wife had taken her last breath. He found it on the 5th floor near the northwest corner. There was no memorial, no flowers, no indication that anything unusual had happened there. Just an empty parking space with oil stains on the concrete and tire marks leading toward the exit ramp. Stefan stood in that spot for nearly an hour, trying to reconstruct the sequence of events. Emma would have parked here after arriving for her shift. She would have walked to the elevator, taken it down to the lobby, worked her shift, and then returned the same way. Routine, familiar, safe. But on that particular night, someone had been waiting. Or perhaps they had followed her. Stefan examined the surrounding area, noting the positions of the security cameras, the sight lines from the stairwells, the distance to the nearest emergency call box. Everything about the garage's design suggested visibility and safety. So how had the shooter approached without being stopped? Stefan requested to speak with the hotel's security manager, a man named Gerald Price, who had worked at the Marriott for 15 years. Price was sympathetic, but guarded. He explained that the hotel had cooperated fully with the police investigation, providing all surveillance footage and access logs. He could not share specific details with Stefan, as the case was still active, but he assured him that security protocols had been followed correctly on the night of Emma's death. Stefan pressed him. Had there been any suspicious activity reported in the days leading up to the shooting? Price hesitated before answering. There had been complaints from guests about individuals loitering in the garage, people who did not appear to be hotel patrons. Security had increased patrols in response, but the garage was accessible to the public, and it was difficult to restrict access without disrupting legitimate business. Stefan asked if Emma had ever reported feeling unsafe. Price checked his records and said no. Emma had never filed a complaint or expressed concern about her commute. She had been, by all accounts, comfortable with the environment. Stefan thanked him and left. But the conversation had raised more questions than it answered. If Emma had felt safe, why had she been killed? Over the following week, Stefan made contact with several of Emma's co-workers. Most were reluctant to speak with him, citing respect for the ongoing investigation or discomfort with discussing such painful events. But a few agreed to meet him privately. One woman, a banquet coordinator named Lisa Chen, told Stefan that Emma had seemed distracted in the days before her death. She had been quieter than usual, less engaged in casual conversation. When Lisa asked if everything was all right, Emma had smiled and said she was simply tired. Another co-worker, a server named Thomas Garrett, mentioned something that caught Stefan's attention. He said Emma had received a phone call during her shift 2 days before she was killed. She had stepped away to take it, and when she returned, she looked upset. Thomas had asked if she needed anything, but Emma had waved him off, saying it was a personal matter. Stefan asked if Thomas knew who had called. He did not. Stefan contacted the police and asked Detective Pierce if they had examined Emma's phone records. Pierce confirmed they had. There were no calls or messages that appeared suspicious. Most were routine communications with Stefan, Marcus, or co-workers. There was nothing that suggested a threat or indicated she was being targeted, but Stefan could not shake the feeling that something was being missed. He obtained a copy of Emma's phone bill through their shared account and began reviewing it himself. Most of the numbers were familiar, but there was one he did not recognize, a local number that had called Emma 3 times in the week before her death. The calls were brief, each lasting less than 2 minutes. Stefan dialed the number. It rang 4 times before going to a generic voicemail. He left a message, identifying himself and asking for a return call. No one responded. Stefan expanded his search. He visited the St. Louis Public Library and requested access to newspaper archives, searching for any incidents in the downtown area that might be connected to Emma's death. He found reports of the robberies Detective Pierce had mentioned, attacks on individuals leaving work late at night, but the descriptions did not match what had happened to Emma. The robbery victims had been threatened, forced to hand over valuables, and then left unharmed. Emma had been shot without warning, her belongings untouched. The inconsistency gnawed at Stefan. He created a timeline, mapping out every reported incident in the parking garage over the previous 6 months. He noted dates, times, victim descriptions, and outcomes. A pattern began to emerge, but it was not the pattern the police had described. The robberies had all occurred between 10 at night and 2 in the morning. Emma had been killed just after 7, during a time when the garage was still relatively busy. Stefan brought his findings to Detective Pierce. The detective listened politely but seemed unconvinced. He explained that criminals did not always follow predictable patterns. Wilson's behavior might have escalated, or perhaps Emma had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Stefan argued that the evidence did not support that conclusion. Pierce became defensive, reminding Stefan that this was an active investigation and that civilian interference could compromise the case. Stefan left the meeting frustrated but undeterred. If the police would not pursue the inconsistencies, he would. He owed Emma that much, he owed himself that much. Because somewhere beneath the official narrative, there was a truth that no one seemed willing to uncover. Stefan's investigation took a darker turn when he discovered something the police had not mentioned. While reviewing local news reports from the month before Emma's death, he found an article about a street sign that had been vandalized near their neighborhood. The sign, marking the intersection of 35th and Braden, had been removed from its post. Police had filed a report but classified it as minor vandalism. The incident had occurred on the same day Emma died. Stefan drove to the intersection. The sign had been replaced, bolted securely to a new post. He walked the surrounding blocks, trying to understand why someone would target that particular marker. The area was residential, quiet, with nothing that suggested criminal activity. But as he stood there, something occurred to him. The intersection was less than a mile from their home, and Emma drove past it every morning on her way to work. He returned home and searched through Emma's belongings, looking for anything that might explain the connection. In her desk drawer, he found a small notebook she had used for errands and appointments. Most entries were mundane, grocery lists and doctor visits. But there was one note dated a week before her death that caught his attention. It was a phone number, written in Emma's careful handwriting, followed by a single word: Crime Stoppers. Stefan's hands trembled as he stared at the page. Crime Stoppers was an anonymous tip line used to report crimes. Why had Emma contacted them? He called the number and explained who he was. The operator was sympathetic but firm. They could not disclose information about tips or callers. It was against policy. Stefan argued that his wife was dead and that whatever she had reported might be connected to her murder. The operator apologized but repeated that the information was confidential. Frustrated, Stefan contacted Detective Pierce again. He explained what he had found and asked if the police had reviewed Emma's contact with Crime Stoppers. Pierce seemed surprised. He said he would look into it and call Stefan back. 3 days passed with no response. Stefan decided to visit Marcus. His son lived in a modest apartment in East St. Louis, a third-floor walk-up with peeling paint and narrow hallways. When Stefan arrived, Marcus looked exhausted. He had been working long hours, trying to distract himself from grief, and it showed in the dark circles under his eyes and the weight he had lost. They sat together in the small living room while Jakob played with toy cars on the floor. Stefan explained what he had discovered, the inconsistencies in the police narrative, the unknown phone number, the Crime Stoppers connection. Marcus listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When Stefan finished, Marcus asked a single question. "Do you think someone killed her on purpose?" Stefan did not answer immediately. He had been avoiding that possibility, clinging to the hope that Emma's death had been random, a terrible accident of circumstance. But the evidence pointed elsewhere. "Yes," he said finally, "I think someone wanted her dead." Marcus stood and walked to the window, staring out at the street below. He told Stefan that Emma had called him 2 weeks before she died. She had sounded worried, asking if he had noticed anyone following him or watching his apartment. Marcus had dismissed it as paranoia, assuming she was stressed from work. But now he wondered if she had known something, if she had been trying to protect him. Stefan felt a chill run through him. He asked what else Emma had said. Marcus explained that she had mentioned seeing the same car parked near their house on multiple occasions, a dark sedan with tinted windows. She had written down the license plate number but told Marcus not to worry, that she was probably imagining things. Marcus had forgotten about it until now. Stefan asked if Marcus still had the license plate number. Marcus shook his head. Emma had kept the note. Stefan returned home immediately and searched every drawer, every file, every pocket of every jacket Emma owned. He found the note tucked inside a cookbook in the kitchen, a place Emma often hid things she did not want Stefan to accidentally throw away. The license plate was written in blue ink, clear and precise. Stefan photographed the note and sent it to Detective Pierce with a message demanding answers. This time, Pierce called back within an hour. His tone was different, urgent and concerned. He asked Stefan where he had found the note and whether he had shared it with anyone else. Stefan said no. Pierce told him to stay home, lock his doors and wait. Officers were being sent to his address. Stefan asked why. Pierce hesitated before responding. The license plate belonged to a vehicle registered to a man named Calvin Torres, a known associate of organized crime in East St. Louis. Torres had been under investigation for extortion and witness intimidation. If Emma had been watching him, or if she had reported something about his activities, she might have been targeted. Stefan felt the room tilt around him. He asked if the police had known about this connection. Pierce admitted they had not. The Crime Stoppers tip had been filed under a different case number and had not been cross-referenced with Emma's homicide. It was an oversight, one that Pierce clearly regretted. But the revelation came too late, because at that moment, Stefan heard a car pull into his driveway. Stefan moved to the window and pulled back the curtain slightly. The car in his driveway was not the dark sedan Emma had described. It was a marked police cruiser. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions serious but not alarmed. Stefan exhaled slowly, realizing he had been holding his breath. He unlocked the door and let them inside. The officers introduced themselves and explained that Detective Pierce had requested they maintain a presence at Stefan's home until further notice. They asked if he had noticed anything unusual in the neighborhood over the past few days. Stefan told them about the car Emma had seen, the license plate, the Crime Stoppers connection. The officers took notes and radioed the information to their dispatcher. One of the officers, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes, asked Stefan directly if he had told anyone else about his findings. Stefan mentioned Marcus, but no one beyond family. She nodded and advised him to keep it that way. If Calvin Torres was involved, any public disclosure could escalate the situation. Stefan understood the implication. He had become a target by asking questions. Detective Pierce arrived an hour later. He sat across from Stefan in the living room, his expression grave. He explained that Emma's Crime Stoppers tip had been about suspected extortion activities in East St. Louis. She had witnessed a confrontation between Torres and a local business owner near Marcus's apartment. She had not identified herself in the tip, but she had provided detailed information about the encounter, including the license plate of Torres's vehicle and the time and location of the incident. Stefan asked why Torres would have known it was Emma who reported him. Pierce said they were still investigating, but it was possible that Torres had connections within the community who had seen Emma in the area that day. Or perhaps he had access to information that should have been protected. Either way, Emma had become a liability. Pierce confirmed that Deshaun Wilson had been charged with Emma's murder, and the evidence against him was substantial. But Pierce now believed Wilson had been hired to carry out the killing. Wilson's criminal record included associations with individuals connected to Torres. The robbery narrative had been a cover, a way to make Emma's death appear random. But the details had never quite fit, and Stefan's investigation had exposed the cracks in that story. Stefan asked what would happen next. Pierce said they were building a case against Torres, but it would take time. Witness intimidation cases were difficult to prove, and Torres had resources to fight back. In the meantime, Stefan needed to be careful. He should not discuss the case publicly, should not visit places connected to Torres, and should consider staying with family until the situation was resolved. Stefan refused. He would not hide in his own home. He would not let fear dictate his life the way it had been forced upon Emma. Pierce did not argue, but the concern in his eyes was unmistakable. Over the following weeks, Stefan continued his routine. He went to work, maintained the house, visited Marcus and Jakob. But he carried an awareness now, a constant vigilance that exhausted him. He checked his rearview mirror obsessively. He varied his routes home. He installed additional locks on his doors. The officers stationed outside his house eventually left, reassigned to other duties as the immediate threat seemed to diminish. 2 months after Emma's death, Stefan received a call from the district attorney's office. They were moving forward with charges against Calvin Torres for conspiracy to commit murder and witness intimidation. The case was strong, built on financial records, phone logs, and testimony from Wilson, who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Stefan was asked if he would be willing to testify about Emma's Crime Stoppers tip and the surveillance she had conducted. He agreed without hesitation. On a Thursday evening in early August, Stefan left work later than usual. There had been a problem with the convention center's air conditioning system, and he had stayed to oversee the repairs. It was nearly 9 when he finally walked to his car in the employee parking lot. The sun had set, and the lot was poorly lit, shadows pooling between the rows of vehicles. He did not see the man approaching from behind. He felt only a sudden, sharp impact against the back of his head, and then the ground rising up to meet him. He tried to stand, but his legs would not respond. His vision blurred, and he tasted blood in his mouth. He heard footsteps, rapid and retreating, and then the sound of an engine starting somewhere in the distance. Stefan was found 20 minutes later by a security guard making rounds. An ambulance was called, but by the time it arrived, Stefan had lost consciousness. He was transported to the hospital with a severe skull fracture and internal bleeding. Doctors worked through the night to stabilize him, but the damage was extensive. Marcus was called, and he arrived at the hospital just before dawn, his face pale and stricken. Stefan Hoffman died at 6:15 in the morning, surrounded by machines and strangers. He was 54 years old. The investigation into his death revealed no clear suspects, no surveillance footage, no witnesses who could identify his attacker. Detective Pierce suspected Torres had ordered the assault, but there was no evidence to support the theory. The case remained open, unsolved, filed alongside his wife's murder as another tragedy in a city weary of violence. Marcus buried his father beside his mother in the same small cemetery on the outskirts of St. Louis. The service was quiet, attended by fewer people than Emma's funeral. Grief had exhausted the community's capacity for sympathy. Marcus stood alone at the graveside, holding Jacob's hand, staring at the 2 headstones that now marked the end of his family. Calvin Torres was eventually convicted on unrelated charges and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Deshaun Wilson pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received a 25-year sentence, but no one was ever charged in Stefan Hoffman's death. The truth he had sought, the justice he had fought for, remained incomplete, buried with him in the earth beside his wife. And Marcus was left alone, raising his son, carrying the weight of two unsolved murders and the knowledge that sometimes seeking the truth costs everything.